Next speaker will be Mr. Robert Whitaker. He will speak about strategies of drug companies to optimize the sales of their psychiatric drugs, especially the rise and fall of the so-called atypical neuroleptics. Robert Whitaker is a former newspaper reporter who now makes his living writing books. He has written widely on the pharmaceutical industry and on mental illness, and he is the author of Made in America, Bad Science, Bad Medicine, and the Enduring Mistreatment of the Mentally Ill. You can have a look at the book at my book stand. In this riveting social and medical history of madness in America from the 17th century to today, Mr. Whitaker finds that so-called schizophrenics in his country fare worse than patients in the world's poorest countries. Mr. Whitaker, sorry for my bad English.
First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to be clear, I'm not a user, since this is the banner of the symposium. I've never been a psychiatric patient, just so you know where I'm coming from. In fact, my introduction to this whole topic was as a journalist. I was doing a series for the Boston Globe on problems in psychiatric drug trials. And one of the things that came up, and this will go to the heart of this conference, is the difference in perception when I would speak to psychiatrists about the nature of neuroleptic medications, and then a very different perception on the part of patients. And it was dramatic. In other words, you would hear psychiatrists tell you these drugs are absolutely necessary, like insulin for diabetes. They're sort of helping cure a physical ailment. And then I would go talk to the patients, and some of them would describe them as torture. And I think when you talk about forced treatment, obviously if you have two perspectives so far apart, and if you hope to sort of find solutions to this problem, somehow you need to address this issue and perhaps understand a little bit each other's perspective. But anyway, as then the thing that my own research I became very curious about was that outcomes in the poor countries of the world, this is what the World Health Organization found, were in fact much, much better than in the rich countries, and they found this twice. And here was the real kicker regarding the drugs, is that they looked at medication use, and they found that in the poor countries of the world, only 16% of patients were regularly maintained on drugs. So all of a sudden, with that outcome, you see some questioning of the wisdom of the psychiatric part of the story. I'm not going to go into that whole story. That's a lot about what Mad in America is about. I'm looking at the research literature and what it does show. But what Peter asked me to talk about today is a little bit about the story of how, in modern times, we became big believers in the atypical neuroleptics, that's risperidone, Zyprexa, etc., as sort of breakthrough medications. And look what the data really showed. And that can sort of show as a case study, in fact, of how the profession can be a bit misled or, in fact, deluded about the merits of its own therapies. So, if you go back when risperidone, and I'm not going to talk about clozapine because that was a special case, risperidone is what really kicked off the atypical story. And when risperidone was brought to market, here was the story about the old drugs, Haldol and the standard neuroleptics, that they were effective in knocking down positive symptoms. Perhaps they might even worsen negative symptoms. And of course, they had the very big problem of triggering extrapyramidal symptoms, Parkinsonian symptoms, tardive dyskinesia over the long term. So if you're a drug company looking to bring a new drug to market that's going to capture that market, you want to be able to tell a story that says you have a drug that's just as good as the old drugs in knocking down positive symptoms, but perhaps improves the negative symptoms and does not cause Parkinsonian symptoms or any of the EPS symptoms. You can see why that would be an advance. You're building on that old story. Now, if you go back and you look at in the medical journals, by the time risperidone came to market in 1994, this is in the United States, by the way, there were 25 different articles that had been published about the clinical trial results. And you know what the story said? The story said was that risperidone was equal to Haldol, or perhaps better in knocking down psychotic symptoms, that it improved negative symptoms, it was better than Haldol in that case, and best of all, that its EPS profile, in terms of its propensity to cause EPS symptoms, Parkinsonian symptoms, was the same as placebo. Didn't cause EPS symptoms. So you can see why that is a great breakthrough. And for example, researchers concluded in one report, our findings suggest that risperidone has important advantages with haloperidol. When administered in an effective dose range, risperidone produced greater improvements on all 5 dimensions of schizophrenia. That's in the medical journals. That's the story told there. Now, in the popular press, it's an even better story. For example, the New York Times, quoting the head of Janssen's clinical research, said that, quote, no major side effects had appeared in trials of more than 2,000 patients. That's a very safe antipsychotic drug. The Washington Post reported that risperidone did not appear to cause, and I quote, sedation, blurred vision, impaired memory, or muscle stiffness. Many of the old side effects associated with standard neuroleptics. Again, a big advance. Dr. George Simpson from the Medical College of Pennsylvania told the Washington Post, the data is very convincing. Risperidone is a new hope, and at this moment it appears, like clozapine, to be different from all existing drugs. Now, because of this, risperidone comes on the market. It's sold in the United States for $241 per month, compared to $36 for Haldol. Big advance, but also a big expense. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing around olanzapine or Zyprexa, but basically it was the same story. Much better than the old drugs, and by the time olanzapine came, here's what Lori Flynn, head of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, said about these new drugs. These new drugs truly are a breakthrough. They mean we should finally be able to keep people out of the hospital, and it means that the long-term disability of schizophrenia can come to an end. Dramatic, almost like a cure is at hand. And I will tell you, and olanzapine, in fact, Zyprexa, charged $314 for a month's supply of olanzapine, almost 10 times as much, and sales of these drugs. So, for example, risperidone comes in 1994. In the United States at that time, we were spending $1.4 billion on antipsychotic drugs. 10 years later, the spending topped $10 billion. So hopefully, it was producing good results. Now, so what I did is I looked at the actual results submitted to the FDA to see is the story well-founded. And I did this through Freedom of Information requests. And by the way, when you do this, you do not get the actual data. What you get is the FDA's review of the data. So what I'm going to tell you now is their own reviews. Anyway, Janssen conducted 3 well-controlled trials. In the first trial, there was 160 patients, and risperidone was found to be superior to placebo in reducing positive symptoms. That's true. But neither risperidone nor Haldol was superior to placebo on the Clinical Global Impression Scale, which is overall improvement. And by the way, the placebo group in these trials is not a true placebo group. What they do in the placebo group is they yank some patients off neuroleptics, and hopefully that will trigger psychosis. If in fact it doesn't, those patients are excluded. So really the placebo group is a group of patients made worse by abrupt withdrawal. So in this first trial, both risperidone and Haldol were equally efficient in knocking down psychotic symptoms compared to placebo, but they weren't even better on this Clinical Global Impression Scale than this group of patients going through abrupt withdrawal. Now, in study number 2, which was involving 523 patients, risperidone was compared to a 20 milligram dose of Haldol. That may raise eyebrows. Anyway, Janssen claimed that this study showed that risperidone was superior to Haldol for treating positive and negative symptoms. This was the basis for those articles in the medical journals. However, here's what FDA reviewers said. They said that Janssen had used a high dose of Haldol for comparison purposes, a dose that may have exceeded the therapeutic window for some patients, and thus was, quote, incapable by design of supporting any claims relative to the relative merits of the 2 drugs. It was a failed study. That's the second study. Okay, the third study involved 1,557 patients. This was their big phase 3 trial, the one that theoretically should have the strongest data. And what happened there is they compared 3 different doses of risperidone to 1 dose of Haldol. Now, any of you who know about clinical trial design know that's not a fair thing, because what happened is you can selectively say, let's look at 1 dose. You can find out which dose presents the best evidence and compare it against this other. It's a flawed design. And what the FDA said, again, it said, and I quote, the study, by its very design, is incapable of making any meaningful comparison between the 2 drugs. Now that was the extent of the clinical trials before the story of breakthrough medication. So what you really find in the FDA's point of view was this, that in terms of efficacy, there was efficacy that it could knock down positive symptoms just as good as Haldol. And as related to placebo, the only thing was, yes, over the short term, but no benefit on that clinical overall outcome scale. It's hardly a breakthrough drug. Now, look at the FDA's safety data, because remember, no EPS symptoms, and basically the idea is risperidone is so much safer. Here's the actual data. 75% of all risperidone patients reported an adverse event, compared to 79% for Haldol, roughly the same. 9% of risperidone patients had to drop out because of adverse events, compared to 10% of the Haldol-treated patients, the same. 18 risperidone-treated patients in the trials died. Remember, no major side effects were reported to the public. 18 died, including 10 by suicide. One patient suffered neuroleptic malignant syndrome, which, as you all know, is a potentially fatal positive reaction. Now, here's what the FDA decided regarding the relative merits of risperidone to Haldol based on these two trials. They said to Janssen, because Janssen wanted to make claims in advertisements that had been shown better. And they said, we would consider any advertisement or promotion labeling for risperidone false, misleading, or lacking fair balance if there is presentation of data that conveys the impression that risperidone is superior to haloperidol or any other marketed antipsychotic drug product with regard to safety or effectiveness. So the public's being told we're a breakthrough drug, a drug with no EPS, an EPS profile the same as placebo. And yet, if you look at the data to the FDA, they're saying this just looks like Haldol to us, and there's no evidence it's better. By the way, do you know how they were able to make the claim that EPS same as placebo? What happens is, as you all know, psychiatrists, is if you abruptly withdraw patients from a dosage of Haldol, many in fact will have a flare-up of EPS symptoms. And roughly 16% of the placebo patients had a flare-up of symptoms. And the low dose, there was one low dose. Remember we had 3 doses in one of the trial designs? In one of the low doses of that study, 16% of patients suffered the EPS symptoms. So that's why they said same as placebo. But of course that's a lot different than the message that this doesn't cause EPS symptoms. Now, what was really interesting to me as well is then what happened when people who were not funded by drug companies looked at this question of safety and the propensity of risperidone to cause EPS symptoms. Well, a Canadian study, and this is a very good study, of neuroleptics. The reason I say it's good is because these patients had never been on neuroleptics before, so it's neuroleptically naive patients, it's a fresh population, found that risperidone caused Parkinsonian symptoms in 59% of patients, compared to 52% of patients treated with Haldol. Higher EPS problems. Okay? There was also a higher incidence of akathisia and dyskinesia than with the Haldol patients. And by the way, you all know Haldol is in the high end of standard neuroleptics in causing EPS symptoms. So it looks like Haldol, maybe even a little worse than Haldol. Then researchers at the NIMH, that's the National Institute of Mental Health, also looked at this question of EPS with risperidone, and they found that when risperidone was compared with Haldol at equivalent therapeutic levels, risperidone induced EPS in 42% of patients versus 29% of those on Haldol. Such that, and I should say this, every single one of the patients treated with risperidone had significantly higher ratings of Parkinsonism compared to placebo. So in a real quick 20 minutes, what I was trying to do here was, as you all know, at least in the United States, we, the society at large, and certainly the psychiatric profession, believed in atypicals as a huge breakthrough. And what I'm telling you is that was not in the data. Last thing here, 2 quick studies. We know that the United States funded a study called the Katie study that compared atypicals to the old standard neuroleptics. They found no difference. And now there's a study that was done in the United Kingdom called the Cutlass 1 study, and they found that, if anything, patients treated with the old drugs, and I will quote, showed a trend toward greater improvements in quality of life scale and symptom scores than those treated with the new drugs. And as a sort of message, a warning here, the question is, I would say to you, if you could become deluded about the merits of atypicals, could you also be deluded about the merits of standard neuroleptics over the long term? And last thing is, because you have the WHO study that found that outcomes were better in the poor countries where people were not maintained regularly on the drugs, and I would advise you to look at a new study published in May of this, just recently, by NIMH-funded researchers. They studied schizophrenia patients over 15-year periods, all patients that had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and here's what they found. At five-year outcome levels, 40% of those patients who had left the medical health system and weaned themselves off medications were basically recovering. Those still on drugs, 5%. They went back and looked at 15 years, 40% still recovered among those who weaned themselves off medication. Among those who stayed on, 5% recovery rate. And all I'm saying is, that's the type of data, in my opinion, and I'm a data guy, is that the psychiatric profession has to look at. Because the final message is here is, I think the data is quite clear that over the long term, this paradigm of care actually increases the chronicity of the disorder. And so when you talk about what we've talked about here, because we're getting, at least in the United States, this sort of requirement to take the drugs, even to live in the community, this forced compulsion. And if that's so, you have to ask yourself, do we as a society have a right to force drugs that people may not want, that it seems, by the scientific data, is going to increase the likelihood that they will never recover? Thanks.